Dr. William had always been a calm and collected man, known for his steady hands and sharp mind, but beneath that composed exterior, a storm of memories churned, memories of a childhood marked by pain and helplessness. He grew up watching his father, a hard-working man, endure years of mistreatment at the hands of Mr. Lancaster, a wealthy businessman. As a child, William felt a deep sense of frustration, knowing he couldn't protect his father from the cruelty that was inflicted upon him. These early experiences became the foundation for his bitterness, shaping his beliefs about power, control, and justice. It was the kind of experience that leaves a scar, one that doesn't fade easily. For William, this bitterness stayed with him long after he became a doctor. In his mind, Mr. Lancaster had been the source of all his father's suffering, and in a way, he had taken that pain on as his own. Now, as an accomplished physician, William had built a life far removed from the man who once tormented his father, but deep down, the old wounds festered, quietly waiting for a chance to resurface. Then, one fateful day, William's path crossed with Mr. Lancaster's once again. The encounter seemed like nothing more than a routine checkup, but for William, it was the trigger that unleashed a flood of old emotions. Seeing the man who had caused so much harm to his father sitting in his clinic was a reminder of everything he had buried inside. And when he was asked to diagnose Mr. Lancaster's condition, something inside William snapped. The temptation to finally right the wrongs of his past was too strong to resist. William sat there, staring at the medical file in front of him, the weight of his decision pressing on his chest. He had heard about Mr. Lancaster's health problems, nothing too serious, just a routine checkup. But for William, this was more than just a simple diagnosis. This was a chance for justice, a chance to make the man who had once broken his father's spirit feel the same fear, the same helplessness. As the conversation with Mr. Lancaster unfolded, William's mind raced with the possibilities. A simple misstep, a small tweak in the diagnosis, and the life of the man who had caused so much pain could be thrown into chaos. The power was in his hands now, and it was almost too tempting to resist. The memory of his father's suffering, the years of emotional torment, pushed him forward. One lie, he thought, just one lie, and I could make him understand what it was like. The moral compass that had always guided him seemed to blur in the face of his desire for revenge. Dr. William leaned forward, his voice steady but cold. He spoke with authority, fabricating a diagnosis that painted a picture of imminent danger, one that was far worse than the reality. He knew that Mr. Lancaster, shaken and vulnerable, would not question his words. He instructed him to undergo a series of tests that weren't needed, tests that would only serve to deepen the anxiety and fear already consuming him. As William wrote down the orders, a small, fleeting sense of satisfaction washed over him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he could finally take control. As Dr. William watched Mr. Lancaster leave his office, the gravity of what he had just done began to settle in. The man's face had been pale, eyes wide with fear, but there was no satisfaction in William's heart, only a growing sense of unease. This was what he wanted, right? For Mr. Lancaster to feel the same panic that his father once did? Yet, as the door clicked shut behind the wealthy businessman, a creeping doubt took root in William's mind. Could this really make up for all those years of torment? The days that followed were strangely quiet. William threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the gnawing voice that kept asking whether he had gone too far. He'd justified it, his father's suffering, his years of watching a man misuse his power. It had all led him to this moment. But even as Mr. Lancaster's anxiety began to spread throughout his family, as the false diagnosis sent shockwaves through his life, William couldn't help but wonder, what would be enough? In the comfort of his own home, as he lay in bed at night, the silence felt heavy. He thought about his father who had always taken the abuse in silence, never once retaliating. William had hoped that by striking back, he could finally settle the score. But deep down, he realized that the anger still simmered inside him, and no matter how much he made Mr. Lancaster suffer, it wouldn't bring his father back, nor would it bring peace. The weight of the past was still there, lurking, as close as ever. The temptation was growing harder to resist. Dr. William had never intended for things to go this far. A small, calculated misstep, just one small error in his diagnosis, had led him down a path he wasn't sure he could turn back from. As he sat in his office, the memory of Mr. Lancaster's face, pale and distressed, haunted him. William had known he would feel something, satisfaction, perhaps, or even a sense of justice. But all he felt now was a cold emptiness. Still, the idea that he could keep pushing forward, that he could hold on to this sense of control, gnawed at him. Every time William replayed the conversation in his mind, he felt the same rush. He had power now, real power, the kind of power that Mr. Lancaster had wielded over his father for years. But in a way, it felt so different. It wasn't for money or business. It wasn't even about gaining anything for himself. It was about watching the man who had caused so much pain suffer. It was about balance, about payback. But as the days passed and William saw the ripple effect his actions had caused, something else started to creep in. Mr. Lancaster, once so assured of his position, was unraveling. He called his family in a panic, telling them about the grim prognosis. His wife cried, his children became visibly upset, and soon, a cloud of worry descended over their home. William had given them a future to fear, a future where their patriarch might not survive. As the family started to prepare for the worst, William couldn't ignore the fact that he had created this storm, and, despite everything, the storm didn't bring him the peace he had hoped for. The ripple effect of his actions continued to unfold in the most unexpected ways. Dr. William couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversations in the clinic, colleagues discussing Mr. Lancaster's deteriorating health, whispers of the diagnosis that was hanging over him like a dark cloud. For a moment, William felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but that satisfaction was quickly overshadowed by something else: guilt. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to remain detached from his patients' emotions. But now, as he watched the family begin to unravel, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the family's fear that unsettled him. It was the fear that was slowly taking root within himself. What if Mr. Lancaster's health really was deteriorating? What if his lies had caused real damage? In the quiet moments between appointments, when William was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of his decision pressed down on him harder than he had anticipated. He had hoped that revenge would be a sweet release, that it would bring some sort of closure. But now, with each passing day, it felt less like justice and more like a personal betrayal. The worst part? He couldn't stop. Dr. William had woven a web of deception so intricate that it seemed impossible to undo. He had already manipulated Mr. Lancaster into unnecessary tests, into a future full of dread, and now the consequences were beginning to spiral beyond his control. His moral compass, once so clear, now seemed lost in the fog of his own making. And as he sat there, reviewing the test results he had ordered, William knew that the deception had only just begun to reveal its true impact. The longer Dr. William carried on with the deception, the more his internal struggle intensified. On the surface, everything seemed to be progressing as he had planned. Mr. Lancaster's family was in chaos. His wife, ever the pillar of strength, was now a wreck, questioning every doctor's visit and every test. His children, who had once been distant and detached, now gathered around their father with a newfound intensity. Their worry was palpable, the once carefree atmosphere in their household replaced with an undercurrent of fear. Yet, the more William watched from a distance, the heavier his own heart became. A small part of him, the part he had buried deep under layers of anger and resentment, started to ask uncomfortable questions. Was this really justice? Did Mr. Lancaster deserve this torment? Sure, he had wronged his father, but was this endless cycle of pain and revenge going to make anything right? Dr. William didn't have answers, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, breaking through the facade he had worked so hard to maintain. The family's unraveling became more apparent each day. William's colleagues whispered about how Mr. Lancaster's once thriving business was beginning to slow down, his employees visibly rattled by the uncertainty of their boss's health. And though William sat comfortably in his office, pretending to remain unaffected, the guilt continued to grow. He had once believed that the lie he had told was harmless, that it was just a small act of retribution. But now, the consequences were becoming undeniable. The fear that had been planted in Mr. Lancaster's family was spreading. The deception had taken on a life of its own, and William found himself trapped in the very web he had woven. As the days went by, the impact of Dr. William's actions became clearer, and it was impossible to ignore. The once tightly knit family of Mr. Lancaster was now a shadow of its former self. The wife, who had always been the rock of the household, was no longer the woman William had seen years ago. Now she was anxious, desperate, and filled with a sense of hopelessness. Her constant worrying over her husband's health turned into sleepless nights and tearful mornings. The children, once confident in their future, now looked at each other with fear in their eyes, unsure of what would come next. William couldn't help but notice the toll this was taking on them. He saw the subtle changes, the way Mr. Lancaster's daughter flinched when the phone rang, the way his son no longer smiled during their family gatherings. There was a heavy cloud of uncertainty hanging over the Lancaster household, and it was all because of the false diagnosis that William had issued. At first, William tried to distance himself from the guilt, telling himself that he was just doing what needed to be done. But as he watched the family fall apart, he couldn't deny it anymore. The weight of his actions was too much to bear. For a man who had spent his career helping others, William now found himself drowning in his own sense of failure. The family was crumbling, and despite the satisfaction he had initially felt, nothing about this revenge felt good anymore. The very power he had sought to wield, the control he had hoped to gain, was slipping through his fingers. He had turned a family's life upside down for something that was never truly worth it. As he sat alone in his office, staring at the medical records, he began to wonder if there was a way to fix what he had broken. But in that moment, he realized how deep the hole had already become. Dr. William had always prided himself on his ability to make clear, rational decisions. He had spent years cultivating a career based on careful analysis and the skillful application of knowledge. But now, every step he took felt clouded by an overwhelming sense of guilt. As he watched Mr. Lancaster's family crumble, he began to question everything he had done. Was it truly worth it? The faces of the children, their confusion and growing fear, haunted him. Even the wife's frantic phone calls to other doctors were starting to make William feel uneasy, as if he had stepped too far out of line. At night, when the clinic was closed, William would often find himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his father. His father had never wanted revenge. He had accepted the injustices, never once asking for anything in return. He had suffered in silence, never showing his pain. William, on the other hand, had spent years nurturing a burning need for retribution, and now, as the consequences of his actions unfolded, he was beginning to see the price of his bitterness. Could he truly undo the damage he had caused? Could he ever make things right? Or had he crossed a line from which there was no return? The more he watched the Lancaster family fall apart, the more he realized that this wasn't just about getting back at Mr. Lancaster. It was about William and his inability to forgive, to let go of the past. The bitterness that had consumed him for so long was now eating away at his conscience, and he was beginning to understand that no amount of revenge would ever bring him peace. But as the family continued to spiral, William felt trapped. He had set this ball in motion, and now it was rolling uncontrollably. As the weeks passed, Dr. William began to notice changes in himself that he couldn't ignore. At the clinic, he found himself more distracted, unable to focus on the work he had once excelled at. His colleagues noticed the shift too. His once sharp attention to detail had dulled, and his patients sensed the change in his demeanor. Where he had once been the epitome of calm professionalism, now he was distant, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the Lancaster family. Small mistakes started to slip through the cracks, missed details, incorrect notes, and though his colleagues quietly whispered about it, William brushed it off, refusing to acknowledge the cracks in his own armor. The guilt weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the impact on the Lancasters that gnawed at him, but his own internal conflict. What had he become? The man who had spent his life healing others was now someone who had knowingly inflicted harm, and the more he tried to bury it, the louder his conscience screamed. He would try to distract himself by poring over medical journals or diving into his next appointment, but all it took was a quiet moment, a brief pause, and the thought of the Lancasters would hit him like a wave. The children, scared and confused, the wife, constantly on the phone with specialists, all of them reeling from the weight of his false diagnosis. One evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing a patient's file, a voice inside him whispered the question he had been avoiding for so long. What now? He had made his choice. He had set everything in motion, but where did it end? Was it too late to turn back? The damage seemed irreparable. The family was already suffering, and, as he reflected on the life he had once dreamed of, a life built on healing, on trust, he realized that he was losing more than just his reputation. He was losing himself. It was an afternoon like any other when Dr. William made the decision that would change everything. The guilt that had been quietly eating away at him had reached a breaking point. He couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't hide from the consequences of his actions. He had been to the Lancaster home before, but this time it was different. This time, he wasn't going there to check on a patient's progress. No, this time, he was going to face the family he had torn apart and confront the weight of his own mistakes. He stood in front of their door, hesitant for the first time in years. His hand, once so steady, now shook slightly as he knocked. When Mrs. Lancaster opened the door, her eyes were red from crying, and her expression was one of confusion, as though she had expected him to be someone else. But when she saw him, her expression softened, and she allowed him inside without a word. It was in that moment that Dr. William realized how far he had fallen from the man he once was. The woman standing before him, once so strong, now looked fragile, and as he stepped inside, the weight of his actions felt heavier than ever before. The Lancaster home was quiet, too quiet. The children, who had once filled the house with their laughter, were nowhere to be seen. Only the sound of Mrs. Lancaster's soft sobs echoed through the empty spaces. As Dr. William sat across from her, the weight of his decision hit him with full force. This wasn't just a doctor visiting a patient, it was a man coming face to face with the family he had destroyed. And as he watched Mrs. Lancaster, who had trusted him, who had believed in him, something inside him cracked. As Dr. William sat there, the silence in the room grew almost unbearable. He couldn't bring himself to speak at first. The words he had rehearsed in his head seemed distant, far too insignificant compared to the reality of what he had done. Mrs. Lancaster sat across from him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. She had been through so much already, but now, here was the man who had caused it all, sitting in her living room, unsure of how to make things right. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, but laced with pain. "I don't understand, Dr. William. Why would you do this to us?" The question hung in the air, and it was the one question he had been avoiding for so long. Why had he done this? Why had he let his anger and bitterness consume him to the point where he could hurt an innocent family? He had no answers, only the weight of his actions, pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. At that moment, something shifted inside William. Seeing Mrs. Lancaster's broken expression, the depth of her confusion, he felt the last remnants of his justification crumble away. He had thought that his actions would bring him some kind of closure, but now, he could see clearly. Revenge had brought nothing but destruction. He wasn't the man he wanted to be. He wasn't the man who healed and cared for others. He was someone who had let his past define him, and it had cost him more than he ever could have imagined. William began, his voice faltering. He looked at her, at the family he had harmed, and the words that had been trapped inside finally came out. "I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was the only truth he could offer." And as he spoke, a part of him finally began to release the grip of anger that had held him for so long. Mrs. Lancaster didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow, as if she couldn't quite understand what was happening. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You're sorry? That's it?" Her words were heavy with the hurt and anger that had built up over the past weeks. William had expected something, an outburst perhaps, or anger, but the silence in her eyes was what struck him the most. He had taken so much from them, and all he had left to offer was an apology that seemed utterly insufficient. As the weight of her words sank in, Dr. William felt a deep wave of remorse. He had seen his actions from his own perspective, the betrayal, the long-held resentment, but he had never truly understood the destruction it had caused for this family. Mrs. Lancaster wasn't angry, not in the way he had expected. She was broken, and that realization hit him harder than any angry words could. But then, in a soft, trembling voice, she spoke again. "I don't know what you want from us. You've caused so much pain. And now you expect us to forgive you?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, William didn't know how to answer. He had hoped that by confessing, by admitting his wrongs, there would be some relief, some way to mend the damage. But the reality was harsher than he had imagined. Forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for. Not now, not when he had shattered their world so completely. William sat there, looking at her, and realized that the consequences of his actions weren't something that could be undone with words alone. He had hoped for redemption, but he knew that it was something he would have to earn. He wasn't sure how he could make amends, but for the first time, he was ready to try. The days that followed were some of the hardest Dr. William had ever faced. The weight of his confession sat heavily on his chest, And though he had been met with anger and disbelief, he couldn't shake the sense that this was the beginning of something important. He had confessed, but that was only the first step. Now he had to face the consequences. The consequences that would ripple out far beyond the Lancaster family. His professional reputation, once a shining beacon of trust, had been tarnished, and no apology could undo that. The hospital had placed him under review, and patients were beginning to cancel their appointments, some citing concerns over his ethical standards. Yet despite the chaos that surrounded him, William couldn't deny the sense of relief that came with the truth. The guilt that had once weighed so heavily on him began to lift, just a little. Admitting his wrongs hadn't healed the damage he'd caused, but it had opened a door to the possibility of healing. And with that came a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. But he knew that redemption would be a long and difficult road. He had broken something precious, and he would need to spend every day working to fix it. Meanwhile, Mr. Lancaster's family was still reeling. Though they had listened to William's confession, their anger hadn't dissipated. They were still grappling with the betrayal, still processing the pain of the deception. It would take time for them to decide whether they could ever forgive him. And in the silence that followed his confession, William understood that he had no right to demand anything from them. He had taken their trust and shattered it, and now, the only thing he could do was wait. Wait for them to decide if there was any path forward, if there was any way for him to make amends. As days turned into weeks, Dr. William threw himself into making restitution in ways he hadn't anticipated. His initial instinct had been to simply move on, to seek forgiveness, but the reality of what he had done was far from simple. He began by reaching out to Mr. Lancaster's family, offering to cover the medical expenses they had incurred from the unnecessary tests he had ordered. It felt like a small gesture, but for William, it was the first step toward making things right. He realized that apologies were hollow unless followed by meaningful actions. But even as he took these steps, the emotional toll of his confession weighed on him. He continued to meet with the Lancaster family, trying to find ways to show them that his remorse was genuine. Yet, their response remained mixed. Mrs. Lancaster was still understandably angry, unable to shake the betrayal that had rattled her. The children, caught between their mother's grief and their own conflicted feelings about William, seemed lost. Some days they would allow him to speak, and other days they would cut him off, unable to confront the depth of the damage he had caused. William knew he couldn't rush their healing, just as he knew his own path to redemption would take time, but he couldn't help but feel the sting of their rejection, a constant reminder of the weight of his decisions. Despite the bitterness in the air, there were small moments where William began to see glimmers of understanding. One evening, Mr. Lancaster, still unaware of the full extent of his own involvement in his family's torment, came to William with a heavy heart. He thanked him for the help he had offered in covering the costs, but it was clear that the wounds ran far deeper than finances. Mr. Lancaster's voice trembled as he spoke, not in anger, but in confusion. Confusion over what had happened to the man he had once respected. William realized, in that moment, that the road to redemption wasn't just about undoing the damage he had caused. It was about understanding the depths of the pain he had inflicted and confronting the man he had become. As time continued to pass, Dr. William began to face the true consequences of his actions. His reputation in the medical community had been severely damaged. Some patients, who had once trusted him with their most personal concerns, began to leave. Others, though, remained, not because they didn't know about the scandal, but because they saw something different in him. They saw a man who was trying to make things right, a man who had acknowledged his faults and was working toward personal growth. It was a humbling experience for William. He had always believed that his skills as a doctor were what defined him, but now he realized that his character, his ability to show true remorse and take responsibility, mattered even more. The hardest part, however, was the lingering silence from the Lancaster family. Despite his best efforts, they had not yet offered forgiveness. Mr. Lancaster's health began to stabilize, but the emotional wounds within the family were far from healed. They had been shaken to their core, and no amount of monetary compensation or sincere apologies could erase the deep sense of betrayal they had experienced. William understood that, but as the family slowly began to rebuild, so too did he. It wasn't just about mending relationships with others. It was about rebuilding his own sense of self. Dr. William knew that his journey toward redemption would never be easy. His life's work, his career, had been built on a foundation of trust, and that foundation had crumbled. Yet, with every passing day, he began to rebuild from the ground up. He started by offering free consultations to those in need, knowing that his actions couldn't change the past, but could shape his future. Slowly, he learned that redemption wasn't something you could simply expect. It had to be earned, one compassionate act at a time. In the end, William's greatest lesson came not from the reaction of Mr. Lancaster or his family, but from within himself. He had sought revenge, but in doing so, he had lost his own soul. The cost of vengeance was far higher than he had ever anticipated, but in confronting his past and making amends, he had found a new purpose. He knew that healing his own wounds was the key to moving forward, not just for himself, but for the relationships that still had the potential to heal.